And welcome back to another episode of the Credit Authority. Once again, I am your host, Rhonda Kulch, and I'm so glad that you tuned in today. So, we have an amazing guest with us. Of course, I love to bring talented and amazing people to our platform. But today, we have with us attorney Joshua Stein. And what I love about your backstory is just the amount of knowledge and skill that is related to your industry. So, first of all, thank you for joining us and tell us a little bit about who you are and what law you practice.
It's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I practice commercial real estate law, meaning we do acquisitions, dispositions, we do a lot of leasing, both kinds of leasing, office leasing, retail leasing, both of those we call space leasing. Then we also do ground leases, which are like 99-year leases of a development site to a developer who's going to put up a beautiful building. In those transactions, it's a lot more like a conveyance of ownership than a space lease, because the developer, the tenant, gets all kinds of rights to build a beautiful building, demolish that building, change the building, and then the landlord just collects coupons. So I've been doing this for a while, and I've done lots and lots of ground lease transactions. I published a book about ground leases almost 20 years ago, and about 20 days ago, I published an updated version of that book.
Now, you and I spoke about that. And when you and I first originally were introduced, what I loved is the complexity of what you do. Normally, you hear somebody say, I love about the simplicity of what you do. There's so much knowledge that goes into understanding your industry. What was it about ground leases and the commercial industry that brought your attention to really the public that needs help in that area?
Well, the ground leases are really interesting animals. They're sort of like a purchase and sale of real estate, but there's a lot more to it because the two parties are going to be tied to each other for 99 years. So you have to think about the flexibility that the developer needs in order to build that beautiful building. And then the landlord wants to think about, how do I make sure the beautiful building, in fact, gets built, and that the beautiful building is, in fact, beautiful. It might not be beautiful. So, the landlord may care about that. The tenant isn't going to be too interested in hearing a whole lot from the landlord, but that's sort of what makes it interesting. And then you have allocation of all kinds of rights and responsibilities about the property. Most of those allocations, the tenant gets the responsibilities, the landlord gets the rights, but the tenant also has plenty of rights to do all kinds of things with the property. Then you have the minor detail of the ground rent, which is that's the number one issue in any one of these long-term leases. How do you adjust the rent over time to give the landlord a reasonable return on their investment, while also giving them some reasonable comfort that if a lot of inflation occurs, their rent will keep up with that. We've looked at like ground leases from 1950, where the rent is just ridiculously low in the current market, because in those leases, they never really talked about having the rent increase very much. So now it's ridiculous. But when we do the leases today, the negotiation of the rent and how it's going to go up over time, that's the number one issue. But there's many, many other issues. How do you come up with a good insurance program? What can the tenant do on the property? What can they not do? If the landlord has some continued involvement, like maybe they have billboards on the site, or they want to get some of the space back, so they can put a store in or whatever, it all gets very, very complicated over time.
Who is your normal client that would reach out to you for service?
There's two categories. I'm talking about ground leases, the landlord and the tenant. We do quite a bit of work for landlords and quite a bit of work for tenants. Their agendas are very different. The tenant will tend to be more risk tolerant, has a lot of creative ideas for what to do about the property. They're going to design something. They might want to change it over time. The landlord, on the other hand, just wants a stable stream of income in place of selling the property. So the landlord's overall concern is, I don't want anything to get in the way of that income. And one of the ways that the landlord makes that income stable and reliable and predictable is making sure that the tenant actually builds the building. Because once the tenant builds the building, the tenant is going to try really hard to make those payments, because if they don't make the payments, they eventually lose the building. The lease terminates and the tenant can't go into the premises anymore, and the landlord gets the building back, which hopefully is a beautiful building, but maybe is a terrible building.
Now, in a scenario where a tenant comes in and they do an extensive amount of improvements, we've had an extraordinary amount of appreciation of these commercial buildings. If I am a landlord and I want to take advantage of the equity position, do I still hold the right to be able to pull equity out of that particular property?
Well, it's interesting. Once you put a ground lease in place, you really have two different interests in real property. You've got the landlord's interest, which is the right to receive all that rental income, and then the right to get back the building in year 99. You may think that's a huge windfall, but really it's so far in the future, and the building's likely to be in pretty bad shape in year 99. So it's not a big deal. But the rental revenue, it is a big deal. So, and then you've got the tenant who has to pay that rent, but also gets to sublease the space to occupants who are going to conduct business. And the tenant's position, the value there is the difference between the ground rent that they have to pay and the space rent that they receive from their tenants. The landlord's value in their position is a function of the rental income that they're supposed to receive under the lease. Now, they can, either party can take their position and go and get financing if the position is valuable. An appraiser can come in and look at the value of the landlord's position, the value of the tenant's position, and then a lender will often be willing to lend to either one of those parties based on the value of their position. And the lender is also going to want to read that ground lease and make sure that it doesn't have any landmines or problems in it, and it has provisions that the lender wants to see to help them preserve the value of their collateral.
I feel like there's so many opportunities available out there. My concerns would be if, again, I'm a landlord, what is my advantage to doing this type of a lease over just a traditional sale?
Well, if you do a sale, you probably owe tax, capital gains tax. In most of these situations, the landlord acquired the property maybe a generation ago, or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago. So there's tremendous gain if they sell at current market rates. So they have to pay the tax. They can try to do a tax-free exchange, which is sort of a headache. Whether you do a tax-free exchange or don't do a tax-free exchange, you have to find a new place to put all that money. And that's not so easy. You have to pay up for a new location. You have to find or in new real estate. You have to find the real estate. You hire brokers. You do your due diligence. You do a closing. It's not so easy. And I've seen a lot of cases where people sell property thinking they'll do a tax-free exchange, and then they end up buying garbage. Or if they don't do a tax-free exchange, then they give a lot of money to the government and then have to find a new place to put that money, which again is not so easy. And if you're a family, if you sell the property, you've got all that money, you spend it on travel and cars and nice new houses, and then it's all gone. Whereas if you're the patriarch of that family and you can do a 99-year lease that's going to throw off money for the next 99 years, that pretty much has a lot of appeal to it, because then you make sure your next generation and the generation after that are taken care of, and you don't have to find a new way to invest that money. So from the landlord's perspective, yeah, you'd like to do a sale, but there's downside to a sale, and you can also, another reason that landlords will often do this, or property owners will do it, is they look at the stream of cash that they're going to receive as a result of the ground rent. They discount that to present value, typically at a low discount rate, and they say to themselves, this pot of cash, the value of which is high, exceeds the amount that I would receive if I sold the property outright. So they're better off taking that stream of cash, than selling the property outright. And that's how a lot of my clients who are landlords, that's how they analyze the situation.
I love it. Well, stay tuned. We need to break for a quick commercial, but stay right there. We're getting ready to bring you a little bit more with Joshua Stein. And welcome back to another episode of the Credit Authority. I'm so glad that you did not move your dial. We are with attorney Joshua Stein, and we are speaking about ground leases. Commercial real estate is not your everyday run-of-the-mill business that people can jump into. And there's so many different opportunities. And Joshua, you are here talking about ground leases. And what I love is you've been educating us on the value from the landlord side as well as the tenant side. But what I want to do is I want to jump in and talk a little bit about this magnificent book that you have created. It is not just a book, it's a trifecta of 3 different components. So tell us a little bit about your journey into writing this 1,800-page book.
Okay, well, I published an earlier book on ground leases almost 20 years ago. And in the time since then, I've done an awful lot of transactions and seen an awful lot of situations that I hadn't seen in 2005. So I decided, by the way, I also, the publisher of the first book ultimately stopped publishing books and gave me back the rights to the book. So I said, it's about time to do an updated version of this. It was really more than an updated version. The old one was maybe 500 pages. The new one is 1,800 pages. And it basically tells you everything that I know about ground leases. And I tried to break it up into 3 pieces. The first piece is what I call the encyclopedia of ground leases, where I talk about like 100 different things that come up again and again. Some of the things we were just talking about a minute ago. How do you adjust the rent? How do you make sure that the developer actually builds the building? What happens at the end of the lease term? All these different issues. So I got like all these encyclopedia entries about things that come up. Then I have what I call my model ground lease, which is a template document that you can use for these transactions. It's got 2 pieces. The first piece is the base case, which is the provisions that you typically expect to see handled in a way that you would typically expect to handle them, and nothing too weird, nothing too unusual, nothing too cutting edge. Then the second piece of that model ground lease is called bells and whistles, which is extra things that you might want to use either in special circumstances or because you're very worried about something. As one example of that, there's a standard way that you typically do your rent adjustments over time. That's in the base case. And then there's a different way that you might do your rent adjustments, but it's disfavored in today's market. That goes in the bells and whistles. But I have language on it because it's something that you do sometimes see. And that's volume 2. Volume 3 of this trifecta, as you call it, volume 3 is other documents that come up again and again if you do ground lease transactions. So I have a ground lease term sheet. I have a sample estoppel certificate. I have sample provisions that you might put into a mortgage that's encumbering a lease. I've got a sample memo that you might give your client about how to administer a lease. And there's about 24 sample documents there. And again, I tried to break them into a base case, which is the usual stuff, and then bells and whistles, which is things you might want to add. And that's the book. Anybody who buys the book gets to have access to editable versions of all the sample documents. I put those in Microsoft Word format, so they're very easy to use. A lot of books, when they include template documents, they put those out in PDF format, which looks good, but it's very difficult to deal with. So we did everything in Word.
Now, my next question is, you practice law in the state of New York. This book will be sold nationwide. Is the information that you are providing in the book, is it information that can be utilized across all 50 states?
Yeah, I would say all the business issues are the same nationally. So if you're simply resolving business issues, pretty much all my language is good. You do have some things that vary state by state. For example, some states say your lease has to have this magic language in it if you want to do anything when the tenant goes into default. Or you're not allowed to have a lease that's longer than 55 years. Or here's some magic language you have to record if you're doing a long-term lease. Those are state-specific things. I'm familiar, of course, with the New York state-specific things. I'm also admitted in California, so I've got the California stuff down, although I don't really talk about it in the book. What my Encyclopedia of Ground Leases has an entry that says, these are the things that often create state-specific issues. So I've got a punch list there of a few dozen legal areas where you might want to call somebody. Let's say we're doing a ground lease in Idaho, which we recently did. And you'd call somebody in Idaho and, what are you supposed to put ground leases on 14-inch paper in Idaho? Are you supposed to have magic language to be able to terminate the lease upon default? That sort of thing. So I did not make an effort to cover Idaho law or really any law other than New York. But 95% of what's in that book will work just fine anywhere in the United States.
And I think it would also be safe to say that somebody who's purchasing the book is purchasing the book very specifically because of a transaction that they are looking to do. But this is not replacing the fact that they should be retaining an attorney to actually draft the documents, I would assume.
Well, it's the book is targeted both toward attorneys who do these transactions as well as toward business people who negotiate them. I would not expect a business person, even a very sophisticated business person, to take my book and say, okay, now I can go negotiate, document, draft, and close ground lease transactions. I wouldn't expect that. But I would expect that such a person would read the book, learn a lot, think about it a lot, and do a better job negotiating and closing their transactions with the help of counsel. And hopefully the business person who wants to make themselves an expert on ground leases and their lawyer, each of them needs to buy the book. So that's very important.
Like that, we need two people to buy the book. I would look at this as a way, because you're obviously the authority in your space and you have an extreme amount of knowledge. Would it be safe to say that if there are attorneys that are listening, that this is a great opportunity for them to potentially partner with you? Or are you not interested in letting people bring you into their cases?
Well, I sometimes do play that role. Like a client wants to do a ground lease. They've got counsel that they've used for a billion years. The counsel hasn't done ground leases. Maybe they've done a lot of occupancy leases, but not ground leases. So I might get involved as sort of a co-counsel or consultant, and I'll make available my templates. I might do the first draft of a document. I might review the drafts. I might sit in on the major negotiation sessions. I might throw in some ideas. I always like working on a co-counsel basis because at the end of each transaction, I always have a new friend. So that's pretty good.
I love it. And just for the sake of time, tell everybody where they can purchase your book.
Oh, that's very important. Thank you.
That's very important.
Yes, I have a website. It's called www.groundleasebook, no spaces, no dashes, just groundleasebook, all jammed together.com. And if you go to that website, you find out all you could possibly want to know about this book, including how to buy it. And we actually set up an e-commerce gateway so that you can buy the book there. I'm actually my own publisher, by the way. There's no other publisher involved. I created a company called Advanced Commercial Real Estate Press, Acre Press, LLC, and that's the publisher of the book. And I'm the publisher. I have copies of the book sitting in a warehouse ready to sell.
I love it. And tell everybody how they could reach out to you if they wanted to retain you for counsel.
Well, that's also a very good idea. The number is 212-688-3300. Please feel free to call. You don't have to arrange the call in advance by email. Just call.
You got it. And how about your email address?
All right. You can email too if you want. Joshua Stein, one word, no space, no dashes, no underscores, joshuastein.com. So it's joshua@joshuastein.com.
I love it. And once again, we are speaking with Joshua Stein. I appreciate you tuning in today. Once again, I am your host, Rhonda Kulch. Stay tuned. We're getting ready to bring you another amazing guest.
Thanks a lot, Rhonda.